If you walked down the wrong alleyway in the capital city at night, you would not just get robbed, you would get erased from existence. It did not matter if you were a wealthy merchant or a beggar. If you were wearing the wrong color, you were a target. The streets of Constantinople in the 6th century were not paved with gold, they were paved with fear. Gangs of young men roamed the districts in packs, hunting for victims to beat or rob. They operated with total impunity, ignoring the city guards. They had a specific uniform designed to intimidate. They wore wide, billowing sleeves that made them look physically larger than they were. Their tunics were specifically cut to hide daggers, iron bars, and heavy stones. They even had a signature haircut that marked their allegiance. They shaved the front of their heads, completely bald, but let the hair grow long and flowing at the back. They called it the Hunnic look. It was designed to terrify anyone who saw them coming. These were not foreign invaders, and they were not enemy soldiers. They were sports fans. Specifically, they were the Ultras. These were the die-hard supporters of the city's two biggest chariot racing corporations, the Blues and the Greens. For decades, these two groups operated like rival cartels rather than fan clubs. They ran protection rackets in the market. They controlled the gambling rings. They murdered rival fans in broad daylight, and the police did absolutely nothing. The authorities were terrified because these factions were too big to fail. They were integrated into the political machinery of the empire. But on a cold January day, something impossible happened. The Blues and the Greens did not fight each other. They stopped looking at the racetrack. They turned around and looked up at the VIP box where the emperor sat. They realized they had a common enemy, and the tribalism that had divided them for a century suddenly evaporated. Within 48 hours, the biggest stadium in the world would be turned into a slaughterhouse of biblical proportions. 30,000 people would be dead. The most powerful economy on earth would be burned to the ground. This is not just a story about a sports riot. This is the story of a state budget collapse, a CEO who lost control of his company, and the most expensive weekend in human history. To understand it, we must follow the money. To understand why sports fans decided to burn down their own city, we have to ignore the stadium for a second. We have to look at the bank account. The year is 532 AD. The place is Constantinople, the New Rome. It is the center of the world. Imagine Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and London all rolled into one massive metropolis. It was a magnet for wealth, holding 2/3 of the world's gold supply within its massive Theodosian walls. Sitting at the top of this empire is a man named Justinian. History books call him an emperor. But for this story, think of Justinian as an ambitious, workaholic, and deeply unpopular CEO who just took over a massive legacy company. Justinian was not born into royalty. He was a peasant from the Balkans who spoke Latin, not Greek. He rose to power through his uncle, a soldier who seized the throne. When Justinian finally took the big chair, he had a massive chip on his shoulder. He wanted to restructure the Roman Empire. He wanted to reconquer the lost territories in the West that had fallen to barbarians. He wanted to build the biggest buildings. He wanted to rewrite the entire legal code from scratch. But corporate restructures are expensive. Justinian had a vision, but he did not have the cash flow. The empire was bleeding money fighting the Persians in the east. To fund his grand vision, Justinian did what every desperate CEO does. He squeezed the customer base. He raised taxes to unprecedented levels. He did not just raise them a little bit, he weaponized them against his own population. He needed a ruthless enforcer to collect these debts. Enter the villain of our story, a man named John the Cappadocian. John was Justinian's chief financial officer and a genius at extracting money from stones. He was widely regarded as the most hated man in the entire empire. John closed tax loopholes that the wealthy aristocracy had been using for a century. He audited the middle class into poverty. He sent agents into the streets to torture shopkeepers until they revealed where they were hiding their gold. The aristocracy hated him because he made them pay their fair share. The poor hated him because he took what little they had. The atmosphere in Constantinople was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The tension was palpable in every street. Inflation was biting hard. Corruption was rampant among the lower officials. The state budget was being sucked dry to pay for wars that nobody in the city cared about. The people were desperate for an escape from their grim reality. The only place they could go to forget that they could not afford bread was the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome was not just a stadium. It was the Roman Colosseum on steroids, a massive U-shaped structure that dominated the city skyline. It held an estimated 100,000 spectators. To put that in perspective, that is bigger than Wembley Stadium. In a city of roughly 500,000 people, that meant 20% of the entire population was in one building. Chariot racing was a massive business, similar to modern Formula One, but with much higher stakes. You had 4 teams, the Blues, the Greens, the Reds, and the Whites. But the Reds and Whites were just subsidiaries. The real power lay with the Blues and the Greens. These were political parties and militias wrapped into one. They influenced policy, they could incite riots, and they could even threaten the emperor himself if they were united. The blues generally represented the established landowners and the orthodox religious class. The greens represented trade, industry, and the growing urban populace. The emperors usually picked a side to keep the peace and balance the scales. If the emperor supported the blues, the greens would be angry, but the blues would protect him. It was a delicate balance of power that had kept the city from imploding for generations. But Justinian broke the first rule of management. He alienated everyone at once. Justinian was officially a blue fan, but in his pursuit of law and order, he decided to crack down on the hooliganism of both sides. He stopped turning a blind eye to the street violence. He wanted to show that the CEO was in charge, not the ultras. This brings us to the spark that lit the fire. A few days before the big race, there was a nasty street fight that resulted in several deaths. The city prefect, acting on Justinian's orders, arrested ringleaders from both factions. He took men from both the blues and the greens. They were sentenced to death by hanging for their crimes against the public order. But the execution was botched. The scaffold broke under the weight of the men, and 2 of them survived the drop. One was a blue, and one was a green. The crowd watching the execution gasped in horror and awe. In the ancient world, if you survive an execution, it is seen as divine intervention. God does not want these men to die. Monks from a nearby church ran in, grabbed the survivors, and whisked them away to claim sanctuary. Suddenly, the blues and the greens had a shared cause. The state was trying to kill their brothers, and God had said no. They demanded a pardon for the 2 men. They expected Justinian to yield to the popular will. Justinian, the stubborn CEO, refused. He announced that the races would go on as planned on January 13th. The men would be re-executed afterward. He thought giving them a chariot race would distract them from their anger. He was wrong. January 13th arrives. 100,000 people pack into the Hippodrome. The air is thick with dust and anger. The noise is usually deafening with chants for drivers, but today is different. Justinian sits in the imperial box, the kathisma, surrounded by his guards. He signals for the first race to start. The chariots take off and the dust flies, but the crowd ignores the horses. They are watching him. By race 22, the chanting changes. It starts in the green section, a low rumble of discontent. Then the blue section joins in. They are not chanting their team names. They are chanting a single word in unison. Nika. It means victory. Normally, you scream it at a chariot driver crossing the finish line. But today, 100,000 people are screaming it at the emperor. They are telling him they will conquer him. The chanting becomes a hypnotic, terrifying roar that shakes the foundations of the stadium. And then, the snap occurs. The crowd surges out of the stands. They do not go home. They spill into the streets. They head straight for the government buildings. They storm the prison, release all the inmates, and set the building on fire. But the fire does not stop there. Constantinople is a dense city of wood and stone. The wind picks up, and the flames jump from building to building. The Senate House catches fire. The original Hagia Sophia Church catches fire. Imagine the Capitol building and the Treasury burning down on the same night. For 5 days, the city burned. The smoke blocked out the sun. The ultras were effectively running the city, setting up barricades and fighting the soldiers. They demanded the resignation of John the Cappadocian. Justinian actually caved to their demands. He fired John the Cappadocian. He fired the city prefect. He gave the mob exactly what they wanted, hoping to appease them and save his throne. But this is a lesson in mob psychology. When you give a riot what it wants, it does not go home. It realizes it has power. They did not just want lower taxes anymore. They wanted a new CEO. They wanted to replace Justinian entirely. Justinian is trapped inside the great palace while smoke seeps under the doors. The palace complex is under siege. Outside, the mob found a man named Hypatius, the nephew of a former emperor. Hypatius did not want the job. He was actually hiding under his bed when the mob found him. The blues and greens dragged him to the Hippodrome against his will. They needed a figurehead for their revolution. They put a golden necklace on his head because they could not find a crown. They proclaimed him emperor. The crowd roared in approval. Justinian is pacing the floor of his palace in absolute panic. His corporate restructure has resulted in a hostile takeover. He orders his ships to be prepared at the harbor. He loads the imperial treasury onto the boats. The plan is to abandon the city and flee. He calls a board meeting with his generals and advisors. They all agree that they have to leave immediately. The city is lost. But there was one person in the room who had not spoken yet. Theodora. If Justinian was the CEO, Theodora was the ruthless co-founder who had the guts to pull the trigger. She was not royal. She was born into the lowest class of the Hippodrome society. Her father was a bearkeeper for the Green faction. She grew up in the dirt of the stadium. She worked as an actress and a courtesan. She knew the mob better than anyone in that room. She knew that if they ran now, they were dead anyway. Exile would only mean a slower death. Justinian stands up to leave for the boats, but Theodora remains seated. The room goes quiet as she speaks. She delivers one of the most famous speeches in history. She tells him that empire is a fine burial shroud. She says she would rather die an empress than live as a fugitive in some foreign land. This shamed Justinian. The CEO realized he could not resign. He had to liquidate the opposition. He turned to his two most loyal enforcers, the generals Belisarius and Mundus. Belisarius is a legend, arguably the greatest general Rome ever produced. He had just come back from fighting the Persians. He had a regiment of battle-hardened mercenaries who were loyal only to him. These were Goths and Vikings, who did not care about the blues or the greens. They did not speak Greek. They only cared about their paychecks. And Justinian just signed the check for total violence. It is Sunday, January 18th. The mob is gathered in the Hippodrome, celebrating their new emperor, Hypatius. They are chanting his name. They think the revolution is over. They think Justinian is gone. Hypatius sits in the royal box, wearing his makeshift crown, looking nervous. He knows he is in over his head. Suddenly, the chanting stops. A strange silence falls over the massive crowd. At the north gate, the gate of the Blues, Belisarius appears with his heavy infantry. They are clad in full armor, shields locked. At the south gate, Mundus appears with his mercenaries. The soldiers draw their swords. These are not riot police with batons. These are soldiers trained to kill in open combat. The crowd is trapped in the U-shaped stadium. The exits are blocked. What happened next was not a battle. It was an extermination. Belisarius ordered his men to charge into the stands. There was nowhere to run. The panic caused a crush as people tried to flee. The mercenaries moved methodically through the rows, cutting down everyone in their path. The ultras who had terrorized the streets with daggers were now facing armored professionals. It was a one-sided slaughter. It lasted for hours. The noise must have been horrific. By the time the sun set, the floor of the Hippodrome was a swamp of blood. 30,000 citizens lay dead in the stands and on the field. That was 10% of the city's population, wiped out in a single afternoon. Hypatius was dragged before Justinian. He pleaded for his life, saying he was forced into it by the mob. Justinian might have spared him, but Theodora insisted on the execution. He was killed the next day and his body was thrown into the sea. The revolution was over. The board of directors had reasserted control. The silence in Constantinople the next morning must have been deafening. Justinian had won, but at a terrible cost. Half his capital was a smoking ruin. The smell of smoke and death hung in the air. His tax base was literally dead on the floor of the stadium. The state budget was empty. The economy was shattered. But sometimes total destruction stimulates growth if you control the contracts. Justinian reimagined the city. Because the church had burned down, he commanded his architects to build something impossible. He wanted a building that would prove his power was absolute and divine. He built the new Hagia Sophia. It was completed in just 5 years and defied the laws of physics with its massive floating dome. When Justinian walked into the finished cathedral, he knew he had won. But beauty has a price tag. To pay for the rebuilding and his continued wars, the taxes did not go down. They stayed high. The people paid for the restoration of the city they had burned. The Nika riots are a warning from history. They show what happens when a government extracts too much value without giving enough back. They show that political factions can be weaponized. But they also show that those factions can turn on their masters in a heartbeat. Justinian survived because he was willing to use absolute force. He kept his throne and built his monument. But he broke the spirit of his people. The streets were safe, but they were silent. The chaotic, vibrant energy that made Rome special was gone. The city was orderly, but it was a graveyard. If you want to know how they actually paid for all this after going bankrupt, you need to understand the dark magic of currency debasement. It is a financial trick that empires still use today. I have a full breakdown on how Roman emperors invented inflation and how it eventually destroyed them. It is the perfect follow-up to this story and explains the economics of the fall. Click the video on your screen right now to watch it. You will see exactly how the Roman economy collapsed from the inside out. I will see you there.